I'm going to talk to you about what we know right now. Um, so we are eagerly anticipating an extension to the Washington moratorium. We don't know for certain whether this will happen or not. There are, of course, always rumors before it happens. And so right now we're just kind of in a waiting pattern to see what ends up falling out. I'm going to very briefly go through the Washington moratorium because I know at this point we have probably all heard some version of this presentation so far. So I'm just going to very quickly reiterate that right now the Washington moratorium currently goes almost to midnight on October 15th. We all know that you cannot be evicted on the basis of non-payment of rent during this time. There should be no late fees being charged on rent that was due from the end of February until current day, and no increases on residential rent are allowed during this Washington moratorium. For the last couple months, we've been talking about the payment plan requirement for landlords that wish to collect on unpaid rent during this time, and I'll touch on that briefly a little bit later. We also want to reiterate that there should be no landlord retribution for tenants who are asserting their rights under the moratorium. Just to remind everybody, because the federal moratorium does apply a little bit differently, the Washington moratorium applies to traditional rental agreements, whether you have a written rental agreement or a verbal agreement. It also applies to other types of housing, including hotels and motels, people in Airbnbs, and campers if you've been there for at least 14 days. And additionally, it applies to people that are renting RV motorhome spaces. You can still be evicted during this time. You can be evicted under the Washington moratorium if you've received a 60-day notice of the owner's intent to live in the property or the owner's intent to sell the property, or if there's been a significant and immediate threat to the health or safety of or property of other people that was caused by the tenants. People who have a lease that's set to expire during this time frame are protected by the moratorium. I want to definitely touch on these two notices, 60-day notice of an owner's intent to live in the property and owner's intent to sell the property, and how the federal moratorium affects this. So before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the federal moratorium. As Laura said, this was a CDC product. It began on September 4th and it runs through the end of the year. The intent of this was to decrease the spread of COVID. Advocates of civil legal aid have the opinion that the federal moratorium is really a floor of protection for all tenants in all states. In Washington, we're very lucky. Tenants have been very lucky to have the Washington state moratoriums. Many other states have not had the types of moratoriums that we have had, and this order helps to protect those tenants. The CDC order says in it that it applies in states that don't have tenant moratorium protections, or that have protections that are not as protective as the CDC's. But it's still, I think that we are still believing that the federal moratorium can apply in Washington right now, even though Washington has its own moratorium. And it applies if there's ways that the Washington moratorium isn't as protective. So for instance, we're going to skip a bullet point. We're going to jump down here. The CDC moratorium applies to rent that was due prior to the COVID state of emergency, which Washington's applies to rent. The rental protections, which require a repayment plan, apply for rents February 29th and after, whereas the CDC moratorium protects from all prior rent due, so it doesn't make that distinction. But it's good to know if we do end up in a situation where the Washington moratorium doesn't get extended, that the federal moratorium does not apply to folks living in hotels and motels like our Washington one does. So that's potentially somewhere where we could see a big change from what we currently have. Very similar to the Washington moratorium, the federal moratorium does allow that tenants can be evicted. Once again, the evictions are really looking at tenant bad behavior, criminal activity, behaviors that's threatening the health, safety of other residents, damaging and causing significant risk of damage to the property, violating applicable health, building, and safety codes, or violating contractual obligations other than payment of rent or late fees. And I've written down here on our bottom bullet that this is unsettled in Washington right now on applicability and must be tested. This has changed a little bit in the last couple days. We have heard from a civil right or civil legal aid group up north that they had a case in front of a judge end of last week that the tenant had been served with a 60-day notice that the landlord was going to either sell or live in the property. And the tenant advocate was able to successfully argue that the federal moratorium still applied and protected that tenant. They argued, you know, what we've said here, that the federal moratorium really creates a floor of protection. And so right now, I think we're going to probably start seeing some challenges to the 60-day notices that tenants have gotten. This takes a little bit of time as those tenants get in touch with legal aid attorneys, and the legal aid attorneys talk to them about whether the federal moratorium is going to be available to them or not. But I do think that we are going to start seeing more of these 60-day notices challenged in the county courts across the state. So the idea that one has already gotten challenged up north and the judge up there has ruled that the federal moratorium still applies and protects that tenant is a big deal. That's important for us to know. Let's talk about the federal moratorium applicability. So all of these have to occur in order for your tenant to take advantage of this moratorium. There's income qualifications. I'm not going to straight read it to you, but they've got to be less than $99,000 in 2020. They received a stimulus check, or they were not required to report income in 2019, plus all of these additionals. So they also are unable to pay their full rent due to an income loss or an extraordinary medical event. We believe that it's more than likely that the court is going to apply the standard that the IRS uses for extraordinary medical event, which is 7.5% of your income, and not what most of us would consider an extraordinary medical event, which we know for the populations that we serve that it can take a lot less than 7.5% of your income to cause a great medical stress or a medical bill. Additionally, the tenant has to have used best efforts to obtain government rental assistance. They must be likely to become homeless or forced to live in close quarters, such as doubling up if evicted. And they must promise to make timely partial payments that are as close to the full payment as the individual circumstances may permit. So in order for a tenant, if a tenant meets all of these qualifications and they would like to or need to use the federal moratorium, for instance, because they received a 60-day notice or because the Washington moratorium doesn't get extended again, then the tenant must fill out a declaration. The declaration that the tenant must be signed under a penalty of perjury. I want to be very clear with everyone and all of the advocates that are on the webinar. I hope that you will be very clear with tenants that you talk to about this, that if they're wanting or needing to make use of the federal moratorium, that they really would be well advised to speak with an attorney first. The Washington moratorium doesn't require tenants to fill out a declaration like this. And the federal one, this federal declaration that they're signing under penalty of perjury, this is a big deal. And it's, we want to make sure that tenants that are doing this are doing it correctly. So the declaration that they're going to sign is going to swear that they have made their best efforts to obtain all government assistance for rent or housing, that they fall into one of the financial qualifications we just talked about, that they're unable to pay their full rent due to substantial loss of household income, loss of work hours of work or an extraordinary out-of-pocket medical expense, that they're using their best efforts to make timely partial payments that are as close to the full payment as possible. Like we just said, that they would become homeless or need to move into a homeless shelter or need to double up if they were to be evicted, and that they still, and I believe this might even be in bold in the Federal Register, that they understand that they must still pay rent and comply with other obligations under the lease agreement, and that fees, penalties, or interest for not paying rent on time may still be charged or collected. I think at this point, we all know that that's different than the Washington moratorium. There are no late fees that are being added on right now. I further understand that at the end of this temporary halt, my housing provider may require payment in full, which would subject me to eviction. And I have bolded this for our purposes. I understand that any false or misleading statements or omissions may result in criminal and civil penalties such as fines, damages, or imprisonment. I don't put this in bold, and I don't hit on it to scare people away from using it. I want us to all make sure that tenants that are needing to rely on the federal moratorium are talking to an attorney first, because this is a serious statement. All tenants of the property do need to submit their own declaration, and declarations can be submitted to the landlord at any time. It doesn't have to be done before they get served with any type of a notice. It can be done at any point up until you're in court. But again, there's a penalty of perjury, so there's significant risks, and it's very important to seek the legal advice. This last blue section has changed in the interim between my creating these slides and us presenting here tonight. As I have said, how this federal moratorium is going to interact and overlay with our Washington state moratorium still is in the testing zone. The action up north this week is a step towards giving us some clues, but until it's tested here in Clark County, I think it's just too early to say for certain. So the most important thing that people need to be doing, tenants, is seeking rental assistance. And I know that Kate and our other presenters are going to speak about this a little bit more, so I'll just raise it right here. Council for the Homeless Hotline is where we are referring tenants also to share. I did see a notice about extended foster care eviction and rent assistance come through my email box yesterday. This looks like it might be a really good option for tenants that were in the foster care system and have aged out at the age of 21 now. If anybody is needing information about that and they didn't receive the flyer, I can email that out to Laura after our presentation tonight, and she can forward it on to you. Other sources, Salvation Army, St. Vincent de Paul. We still encourage people to check in with their local churches for private donations, and food bank groups are a good resource. So whether the Washington moratorium gets extended or not, we're still really advising people to work on getting their documents together. I know this slide was on our last presentation, but a little bit of it has changed. For Washington, the inability to pay because of COVID is an element, but for the federal moratorium, people will need to be able to document their loss of income or medical bills. Really paying attention and gathering and creating a file of any documentation that you have possible to show where your loss of income originated from, past pay stubs, everything that we've discussed previously. This second one is going to become very important if the Washington moratorium doesn't get extended. What were your tenants' attempts at getting rental assistance? I know we've heard from a lot of tenants that have started to feel defeated or becoming frustrated at the difficulty to get through sometimes. And we are really advising people to not lose hope, really have patience. We know that everybody is working as hard as they possibly can and putting in a lot more than we ever thought was going to be required of our jobs this year. But we are advising tenants to keep a journal of all dates and times that they attempted to get in contact with rental assistance groups. Anything they can note down, who they spoke to, when they spoke to them, how many times they called, how many times they left messages, every bit of the communication that you have with a rental assistance provider should be jotted down in a journal, so that if it does come up in court later, you can just flip it open and go right down your list and show everything that you have done. Again, the offered payment plan wasn't reasonable. If the tenant ends up in court, we're going to need to be able to show why what was offered by the landlord wasn't reasonable to them. So, and having tenants start keeping a folder of bills that they've paid, anything creative that they have done to try to get money to their landlords. If they're taking their kids to school to pick up school lunches every day, to try to cut down on grocery bills, anything that they can think of to include with that to show why they're not able to pay their rent, or why they weren't able to pay the full amount of their rent, will be helpful to us later on. I'm going to really breeze over this. I know a lot of us have talked about it multiple times. The payment plan, we want to just reiterate that landlords are definitely allowed to contact tenants right now to set up a payment plan. The most important advice I would give to tenants right now is do not ignore your landlord's attempts to arrange a payment plan with you. Again, tenants are entitled to a payment plan that's reasonable for them given their individual circumstances, their financial and health circumstances. So again, this means that we're not looking for one-size-fits-all plans handed out to everybody in the building. The Washington Attorney General's website still has their payment plan up online. And like we just said, if the payment plan that the landlord has offered or after negotiations is still pushing on them isn't reasonable for the tenant, then what documentation can they put together to prove that? I would like tenants to be keeping every communication that they have with their landlords, really advising them to do things in writing. If they are doing things via text message, which we know is just kind of the way that this business happens nowadays, screenshot it, print them out, start getting your own file together. So let's sum up. Still, many tenants are protected until October 15th under the Washington Moratorium. Tenants that are receiving 60-day notices should be advised to contact either us or the CLEAR hotline to get in contact with a legal aid attorney to talk to them about whether there's anything that they can do, whether they're eligible to try to claim federal moratorium protection. Please be helping anybody you know out there pass the word along to everybody about rental assistance that's available and the websites and phone numbers that they can get it from. I know one of our biggest challenges is reaching out to everybody that needs this information, really encouraging everybody you know to share it and spread it. Tenants should not avoid communications from their landlords. One thing, feedback we're getting from landlords and landlords attorneys is that it has become so frustrating to try to get in contact with tenants that they're trying. Tenants are ignoring them or avoiding them. We know we can speculate why tenants do that if they do. Most of the time it comes from an imbalance of power, tenants being scared, not speaking the same language. There are a lot of barriers to tenants feeling like they are empowered enough to talk to their landlords. But we really want to make sure that if they are feeling that they are not able to talk to the landlords themselves, to please be calling into us or CLEAR and see if there's something we can do to facilitate that communication. We don't want to end up in a situation where landlords are going to court and saying, I called them, I emailed them, I couldn't get through, I did my best. We want to be able to show that the tenants are doing their best too. Tenants who are receiving notices or information from their landlord that they are going to be evicted or that they need to move out or that their lease is not being renewed and they need to move out. If they don't have the ability to move out and move into a new apartment or house, we would really advise them to get in touch with an attorney as soon as possible so we can help work them through what their options are. And this last point I would really like to emphasize, the law is constantly changing right now. I was nervous to give this webinar tonight because I think that really in the next couple days we might be seeing action to extend the moratorium. And I do think that there's reason to think that if this next one gets extended, that it's going to be a little different. The last couple have been more or less the same with just very minor tweaks. And I think there's a potential that if it gets extended again, there could be some real changes. So if we do see an extension, everybody that's reading it or trying to make sense of it, please look beyond just simply the extension date and go through the language to see how else it has changed if we get an extension. Additionally, I think we can do this on our next slide. New rental assistance funds. I have hope that we might see more stimulus changes and stimulus funds come through. I think at this point we should all try to work to keep that hope. Anytime your organizations see any rental assistance funds coming through, let's work together to make sure that we circulate that so that we all have as much up-to-date information as we can. There have been legal challenges to both moratoriums. A lawsuit has been filed in Washington state, and I believe there's also federal ones either getting ready to be filed or have already been filed. We don't know exactly how quickly those will move through the courts, but it's good to be on alert that they're out there and be keeping your head up and watching the news to see if anything happens. We at our organization would like to know if you're seeing sort of what we're terming creative moratorium workarounds. If you are noticing a trend or you have a landlord that you work with that is doing something that you are wondering if it's problematic or it seems problematic for the tenants you're working with, even if it's not barred by the moratorium orders, we'd like to be on alert for what the trends are. And the last thing that I want to mention is that court processes could change. I've been very surprised with how much has changed over the last 6 to 8 months out of necessity, and the courts are no different. I think that many of us know at this point that most court proceedings are going forward via Zoom. The courts have been really adaptable, and it's quite possible that the processes for how evictions go forward could also change. An idea that has been going around is whether to have mediations offered before landlords could go forward with evictions. As of right now, that's not the process in Clark County, but there are counties in the state that are starting up under a pilot program to try to work through this. Clark County is looking at it right now to decide how they want to handle it. So it's quite possible that paid for mediations without fees to tenants could be offered as a service to tenants in the future. If that's something that happens, we will try to get information out on it, but tenants should be kind of on the alert for receiving different notices that they might not have seen before, and we would really encourage anybody that's receiving notices that they don't know what they mean or they're wondering if that's a possibility for them, to please call into us or the CLEAR hotline so we can help explain what that notice might mean. And just our last page here has got this is our general email. You can email into that email to try to get a hold of us, and our intake housing coordinator will give you a call back, or this phone number. And you can also follow us on Facebook and social media, and we try to put out updates whenever, certainly if there's a Washington moratorium extension, there will be an update, but also if there's a new court process such as a mediation requirement, we would definitely update that on our social media as well. So I am going to try and give this back to Laura.
Thanks, Jessie.
There we go. Awesome. Thank you for bearing with me. I am a bit under the weather, so I feel like I'm real froggy tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here tonight. Okay. I'm gonna try to show my screen again here. Bear with me. And get back to my PowerPoint here. And next, I would like to introduce Carolyn Palmer with St. Vincent de Paul. Carolyn's been an active member of St. Vincent de Paul Society since 2008, and she was hired as the executive director in 2016. And she is going to talk to us about how St. Vincent de Paul has been helping in our community using CARES Act and other funding to support folks during this difficult time. So Carolyn, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Laura and Jesse and Kate for inviting me and all those participating in this webinar tonight, because we are all aware homelessness and potential evictions in our community is a major problem. And our largest program here at the Vancouver St. Vincent de Paul is helping families with their rent payments. As Laura's slide indicates, our rent calls are taken on Wednesday from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. If a caller is seeking assistance with multiple months of past due rent, we do encourage them to call the housing hotline just to see if they're eligible for a longer period, as we are limited to only 1 month assistance, and most time it must guarantee they'll remain stable in their home too, as that's one of our questions we do ask. What are you going to do next month? Our fiscal year just finished here last week on September 30th. So this past year, we helped 269 families, spending over $223,443. It's a lot of funds to filter into the community. By helping a family pay part or all of their rent with our donor funds, we assisted 165 of these households. During COVID-19, we were very fortunate to receive a $50,000 grant from the Community Foundation for Southwest Washington. This helped us with an additional 43 families where we could pay their entire month's rent. We also received government funds from the EFSP, it's the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, and also CARES funds. We have spent approximately $76,670 and have helped 61 of these additional families, totaling the 269. Our hope is that they can remain in their homes and maintain stable lives. The Society conducts a home visit. We normally visit in pairs, and our main reason for this visit is to personally get acquainted with the wants of those in need and to see the face of Christ in the poor. Our volunteers are not social workers, and we're not gathering stats for agency purposes. It just provides us the ability to listen to their story and have a better understanding of their life situation. Of course, during COVID-19, like all of us, this service came to a quick stop, and we've had to make policy changes to our home visits, and they are now conducted by a phone, where we make the initial intake is done on a Wednesday. It's followed up with a second phone call to complete the home visit and work directly with the landlord. And at this point in time, we always encourage all of our families, please utilize our food and clothing, or not clothing, but our food pantry, and where we can provide food and hygiene. We also pay landlords, not the tenant. Other services we can provide is some utility assistance. A lot of our families are in a crisis in that, and last year we were able to help 176 families. We provided 40 families with emergency shelter, do some other miscellaneous services. And then, of course, for those of you that may not know it, we are an emergency food pantry under the umbrella of the Clark County Food Bank. And just this past year, through the Clark County Food Bank fiscal year, we distributed 881,000 pounds to 53,522 people, and that helped 18,778 households. So we do a lot here, and we'll continue to do some amazing work, but mostly it's done by volunteers. And I just have to give a shout out of thanks to all of our volunteers that help make this happen.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
We value your partnership. Okay, next I would like to introduce Kate Budd, who's here from Council for the Homeless, who's here to talk about our emergency rental assistance program provided through CARES Act dollars that have come into our community. CARES Act money has been used to prevent households who have lost income due to COVID-19 from falling into homelessness. And so far, in the past several weeks alone, more than 530 households have been served using more than $2 million. Kate, can you share how this program is going and how it's been helpful both to landlords and tenants, and just kind of speak to the need for this type of assistance, what it's been here in Clark County?
Sure, absolutely. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us, Carolyn and Jesse, and to all the attendees. I am thrilled to see so many advocates and helping service professionals on the line. Like Laura mentioned, the largest rent assistance program that has come into our community is through CARES Act funding. That was provided at the federal level to the state of Washington and then allocated through Clark County to a number of different agencies here in the community. So in total, there is approximately $5.5 million that arrived in early August. And as Laura shared, as soon as it came into the community, agencies got to work providing those dollars to families and individuals that are having a hard time paying their rent. There are two primary access points for the eviction rent assistance program, which is what that $5.5 million is called, or ERAP, less formally. And the ERAP dollars were provided to share Council for the Homeless, Lifeline Connections, and Impact Northwest. And those dollars were to serve all families that qualified for as long as the dollars lasted. And then there was also an additional amount of money to make up that 5.5 million that was targeted to youth-headed households. So basically, a head of household that is under the age of 25 has a specific pot of dollars that can help provide rent assistance to that family or individual. And those dollars were provided to Council for the Homeless as well as Janus Youth programs. In order to access those dollars, Share could be called, and they have a line specifically for people who are Spanish speaking, as well as a general entry line, and then Council for the Homeless. And we have Spanish speaking staff members who are most often there at the housing hotline, as well as connections to interpreters through an interpretation company. So our goal is to serve as many households as we can within the guidelines that are provided. The maximum amount of rent that can be provided is 3 months. And we are seeing that there are families where that 3 months of assistance just isn't covering all the rent that they owe. We've seen families that as soon as COVID hit, they couldn't pay rent. And so they're coming in with 6 months and now 7 months of rent that's owed. We work to try to weave together resources that exist, but unfortunately those are more few and far between when we have to move beyond those initial 3 months of assistance. We also recognize, as Laura mentioned, that communities of color and marginalized communities, such as the LGBTQ community, those who are living with HIV/AIDS, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, are all most greatly harmed by COVID. And so as a result, when the Department of Commerce at the state level created this program, they said there should be ways for agencies that work with culturally specific groups and marginalized communities to be able to refer people to get assistance. And so among all the agencies that provide this ERAP program, there are 12 agencies that can refer directly. And so I also want to encourage yourself, or if you're an advocate working with someone, if they happen to work with a specific agency like the Advocates for Deaf and Hard of Hearing or Cascade AIDS Project or Peace Northwest, check in with them to see if they might be able to provide a different way for them to access those emergency rent assistance programs, because there are a few referral opportunities for folks. Laura also mentioned that over 530 households have been served through the ERAP program thus far. That, of course, increases every single day, and we're thrilled to have been able to support that many households. I can tell you, unfortunately, we're seeing that the need is enormous, as many of you can likely guess. And so we are also facing a very significant wait list of households that have called in, but haven't been able to get help yet. And we'll continue to move forward providing rent assistance until those dollars are gone. But I will share that if you have a household who you're working with who hasn't been able to access rent assistance yet, and they tell you they're on a wait list, that's realistic. Maybe a month from now, if they share with you that they weren't able to get rent assistance and that they were contacted by the Council for the Homeless, that could be realistic too. If the dollars run out, then we will reach out to folks on the wait list and let them know. We, like Jesse, are hopeful there might be additional rent assistance resources that will come to the community. We're holding our breath to see if that happens. But if it does, we'll just continue to work with the same wait list that we have to extend the number of households who received assistance. I would also like to share that among the 530 households, over 35% of those heads of households identify as someone who's a person of color. And not only is that a requirement that there be a high percentage based on the proportionality within the community of persons of color, but it's also priority locally. We, again, recognize that populations of color have been greatly harmed by COVID. We want to make sure that we're helping them as greatly as we can be able to pay their rent and be able to pay and not deal with evictions when the moratoriums do finally end. So just wanted to share that that work is occurring here in the community. I did also want to share regarding the eviction moratorium extension potential that Jesse mentioned, that the governor has worked with a coalition of landlords and tenants since this current eviction moratorium was set to talk about what changes need to happen and try to balance the needs of tenants with landlords, because we know that this is affecting landlords too. Especially the smaller mom and pop landlords. So that is also a reason why it's really important, if the eviction moratorium is extended, to read all the fine print, and we might even do another webinar because it's going to be important to understand what those tenants are. A couple factors that our governor is very likely considering is that Oregon has extended their eviction moratorium through January 8th. And we know that the governors from Oregon and Washington tend to mirror one another and things that they've done with COVID, at least. And then we also have advocates, particularly for people who are in poverty and folks who are at risk of homelessness, asking for a moratorium that even suppresses Oregon to March 31st. And so those are just things that our governor is having to think about as he considers what to do next. And that I think it's helpful for all of you to be aware of as well. And we'll be on the lookout for any reports that the governor shares regarding an extension of the eviction moratorium. Thanks, Laura.
All right. Thanks, Kate. All right, so we have a little time for some questions and answers, and there's been some in the chat or in the questions portion of the control panel. I do apologize. I think during the beginning of the webinar, just based off of some of the questions here, we had some technical difficulties with our audio. So hopefully we'll be able to put together a complete recording for you. We'll do our best. And if there's a little time, I might even revisit some of those earlier slides just to make sure that we cover everything. But for now, I do see a couple of questions. There is a question that Jesse, you may be able to answer. Have there been any evictions on the Clark County Court's docket since the moratorium?
There have been a few, yes. We get an update from the court when an eviction has been docketed. The couple that have come through have been health and safety risks, and I will say that there's maybe been 10, probably less than 10, if without my pulling the sheet up and looking. I would say 7 or so of them have been pretty legitimate things that you would read and say, yeah, if that is true, then that is an actual situation that does cause health and safety risks. A couple of them have been more on the fence. You might need to hear some testimony from the parties about what went on to really see, but for the most part, we haven't seen too many get filed that are really pushing the bounds of what the order allows for, and that's not surprising. We've got pretty good landlord attorneys here locally, and they are doing a pretty good job of following the orders. We have started to see people getting 60-day notices to sell or owner occupy. Our volunteers with our office and also with NJP have been working with those folks to see if they can negotiate with the landlord, and so far most of those have been okay. We are getting ready to see a couple in the next couple weeks that we might look more towards the federal moratorium to handle those. We have also had a couple people call in and say that they've gotten one of these notices, but they have seen also that their place, their apartment, or their house has been put up on Craigslist for rent, and so they have concerns about whether the landlord is actually going to live in it or sell it, or if it's just pretextual. Anything like that, if you are a tenant that is having that going on, or you're a helper or advocate for somebody and they think that that's what's happening, we would have them call us or Clear right away, and also take a picture. We've had a couple people say it's on Craigslist, and then by the time we get on a couple hours later to look, it's been pulled. And so if you're seeing that happen, take a picture, print it off, make sure you've got your proof.
Great, thank you. We had a question about help for folks in Washougal. I do want to say that people in Washougal would contact Council for the Homeless, just the housing hotline, that works for anyone in Clark County. All right, so here's a question. What is the first step people can take if they get an eviction notice? That'd probably be for Jesse.
If they get an eviction notice, the first step that they should be taking is contacting legal help, because right now there should be no eviction notices happening. If it's anything outside of those 3, safety hazard, notice that they're owner occupied, or owner's going to sell, and even then I think they need to contact us to see if the federal moratorium is applicable to them. We have seen tenants, we're still getting calls. Our housing clinics are full every single week still with tenants that are getting weird notices, and a lot of times those are coming from your smaller mom and pop landlords that maybe just don't know exactly what they're allowed to do right now. So there are people getting weird notices. I would tell them that if they feel empowered and they feel like they're educated on the law, to go ahead and respond to their landlord in writing, respectfully, non-aggressively. But if they have concerns at all, call us or call Clear to talk to an attorney.
Great. And we did have a clarification. So St. Vincent de Paul and St. Thomas and Camas also help in Washougal. Thank you, Tom Iberly, for that. Okay, I think what I want to do, I'm going to improvise a little bit here with the few minutes that we have left. I want to go back because I think that people couldn't hear earlier at the beginning of the webinar. And so I just want to sort of sum up in a nutshell what is, what the potential scenarios are. This is very high level, like, very broad. Jesse, of course, definitely got into much more detail. And I want to call your attention to these handouts that we have provided. You can see those in your control panel. You're able to download those. You can save them, print them, refer back to them as needed. So that's a little bit more information that hopefully will be useful to you. And let's see. I hope that the potential scenarios kind of make sense. And again, we still have protection for Washington residents at least through October 15th with our Washington moratorium. We do feel like it's likely to be extended past October 15th. We just don't know the details yet. And the advocacy opportunity here really is to ask our governor to extend the eviction moratorium through March of 2021 so that the legislature can, systemically deal with this issue rather than just keep, continuing to push it out, 2 months here, 6 weeks there. So we'll see what happens with that. And if at the very least we do have a federal moratorium that will go till December 31st, which again, the protections are not as good as the one that the Washington moratorium is at this moment. However, there are some protections in that are worth pursuing if you need them. So, okay, so I don't think I see any more questions. Let me look again. All right, let's see. So I do see a question here about resources for landlords to sort of maybe something to give folks to de-escalate interactions with tenants. Is there a resource for landlords? Jesse, do you know of anything like that, or possibly Kate?
So I guess I'll share that thank you. I recognize that landlords are might be dealing with very frustrated and angry tenants, and of course it vice versa with tenants and landlords. And so one thing that I think would be very helpful is honestly just to Google de-escalation, and I know we have some documents, but honestly a lot of times it's just about giving people space and listening, and being outside often can make a big difference. And there's a kind of environmental change that happens when people have the space that they need to walk around or to be frustrated, and that you're not close or feeling enclosed. And so providing space, listening, as opposed to just trying to argue or put points forth, as well as just talking over the phone, are two suggestions that I have just regarding general de-escalation for folks. But we can also, if you don't find anything, feel free to email us, and we can share a de-escalation tips document too. And again, recognizing that it's a tough situation for everyone involved with this eviction moratorium.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Okay, let's see. So I'm gonna move on to our community call to action for tonight. And I just, again, wanna thank everyone for attending tonight's webinar and just bearing with us with our technical difficulties. And I think, the theme here is, you know, we're living in a time of uncertainty. We have to sort of be ready to adapt based on what's going on. 2020 has been nothing but an exercise in that. And advocacy is always needed. So advocacy on this issue in particular couldn't be more timely or effective. So I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to sign up to our housing advocacy email list on our website. I think I also included that in some links that I sent out and some email confirmations. It's councilforthehomeless.org/advocacy. I'm going to also encourage you to email Governor Inslee right away. I'm going to post his email address in our chat box here shortly. And just, you know, we also, I think what we've learned, you know, recently is that we need to recognize and address systemic racism. And if we're serious about ending homelessness and achieving housing equity, we must center racial justice in that work. People with very low incomes struggle to afford to live in Clark County, and we can increase investments into long-term housing supports, and we can increase access to affordable housing at a time when it's never been so clear that housing is healthcare. And so also people experiencing homelessness can vote. Online voter registration is October 26th, or that's the deadline, I should say, to register to vote online is October 26th. But people can register in person at the elections office all the way through Election Day on November 3rd. And you don't need an address to vote. And again, you know, we say this every time, but, you know, bust the stigma of homelessness and housing insecurity. If these past few months have taught us anything, it's that a cycle of poverty, poor health, lack of income, and lack of affordable housing are huge factors contributing to homelessness. And hopefully tonight you've been given some information about what's out there to help folks. If you know of anyone in need, please share this info. And lastly, be kind. It's contagious, and kindness is good for everyone. And we hope to see you again in just one short week for our webinar with Mark Jones. So again, thank you so much for attending our webinar tonight. And we will, what I'll do is send out Governor Inslee's email. You can also just find it online, but with our follow-up communications. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll keep you updated, as always, on what's going on with our eviction moratorium.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Jesse and Carolyn, thanks for being here. It was good to see you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, Laura, I didn't know if maybe I missed giving you the St. Vincent de Paul Helps Washougal too when you put it in the slide, because I cut that piece out of my presentation because you shared it on the slide.
Oh, okay.
So
I'll
yeah,
send that out.
Washougal is included with the St. Thomas Conference. Their service area is Camas Washougal.
Okay, perfect.
I always realize that after I'm like, oh darn, I X'd all that out. I should have probably said that to the listeners, but that's okay. All right.
Yeah, you know, it's always definitely, you know, we always think twice about what we're sharing, and yeah, we'll definitely make sure to get that info out there.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to just log out of here. Thank you for having us.
All right. Yeah, thanks so much.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.